First on our list, being buried alive. This was a punishment that was certainly active in many ancient societies. It was actually used quite frequently in ancient Egypt as a form of capital punishment. While it is not known which criminals would receive this brutal form of punishment, we can only assume that it was used for very serious crimes. The Egyptians actually had tombs created that were dedicated to live burials for criminals, so it appears that this method was used more frequently than many people might think. Archaeologists have uncovered many Egyptian tombs over the years, but it turns out that some of them might have been the result of burial punishments. This was also a cost-effective way to deal with criminals that the government simply didn't want to deal with anymore. It was obviously very inhumane, but the Egyptian pharaohs saw this as a very effective method. Knowing that you could be buried alive for your bad decisions would definitely be an effective way to keep criminals from committing any more serious crimes. Next on our list is impalement. This one is exactly what it sounds like, and it is incredibly gruesome. This form of punishment was used for various types of major crimes such as adultery and grave robbing. It was definitely haunting the nightmares of many criminals in ancient Egypt. This type of punishment actually came in many different forms, as it could be used as capital punishment or very painful torture. The authorities would tie the convicted criminal to a post where they would then be impaled by a large spear. While the torturer would sometimes deliver a direct blow to the heart or brain for capital punishment, other times they would just take out a leg or an arm for torture purposes. This form of punishment would also sometimes be used on suspects who the authorities were pressing for answers during an investigation. Whether it was a death penalty or torture, the threat of impalement was just another way the authorities in ancient Egypt kept potential criminals in line. Up next we have hand amputations. Well, now that we've seen that ancient Egyptians were not afraid to use large spears for punishment, it shouldn't be too surprising that they were willing to take things one step further. This gruesome form of punishment was originally invented for grave robbers who had been caught in the act. Now, grave robbing was a serious problem in ancient Egypt, as many people were interested in finding buried treasure that people had brought with them to the afterlife. Pharaohs realized that this was a huge problem, so they came up with a very scary tactic to deal with anyone who was caught in the act. Authorities were sometimes instructed to chop off the hands of any grave robber who was caught in the middle of their crime. They saw this as the most effective way to deter anyone from robbing a grave, as no one would ever want to live the rest of their lives without the use of their hands. After that, we have the beating of 100 blows. This was perhaps the longest and most grueling form of non-capital punishment that could be issued in ancient Egypt. This was another punishment that was initially created for grave robbers, but was eventually used to punish a wide range of petty thefts. First time grave robbers wouldn't always be subjected to an amputation, but there was another rough form of torture that was awaiting them instead. Authorities would gather in a group and deliver a grand total of 100 blows to the convicted criminal for their actions. It is not known how they settled on 100 as the magic number, but the guards would strike the criminal with whips while they were forced to endure the brutal pain. One heavy hit from a whip can leave anyone with a very nasty wound, so we can't even imagine how 100 of them must feel. Criminals would not be able to move after such a heavy beating, so this would obviously keep them away from any grave sites in the near future. Next up, we have donkey torture. It turns out that donkeys played a major role in ancient Egypt's justice system. Now, just to be clear, this is nothing like pin the tail on the donkey, and nobody has any fun in this twisted scenario. This was another form of punishment that looked to punish grave robbers, but there was a very specific type of grave robber who had to face the donkey. The animals would be brought in to punish anyone who even attempted to rob the grave of a fallen pharaoh. While other robbers would be beaten or have their hands removed, these criminals who defaced the resting place of a pharaoh would be taken advantage of by a donkey. Yes, that is exactly what it sounds like, and it is absolutely disgusting. But even despite this terrible punishment potentially awaiting them, some people still decided to take the risk to try and rob the fallen pharaoh of their riches. Next on our list is burning. This is another pretty self-explanatory and equally brutal punishment. Burning was a common form of punishment that was often used for anyone who was caught in the act of adultery. Now, back in ancient Egypt, adultery was seen as one of the worst crimes a person could commit. Pharaohs and authorities saw this as a direct disruption to Egyptian society that brought tremendous shame to the ancient empire. Because of the strong views and opinions the empire had on adultery, the punishments that were handed out to anyone who was found guilty of the sin were beyond brutal. One of the punishments that the ancient empire used frequently was the simple method of burning. Authorities would light the criminal's body on fire until they sustained terrible burns or simply succumbed to their injuries. This meant that it was really a toss-up if the criminal would receive capital punishment or not. If they did survive the burning, however, the criminal would be left with terrible scars that they would have to live with for the rest of their lives. After that, we have slavery. This type of punishment was extremely common for criminals who were guilty of committing petty crimes. It was extremely common in ancient Egypt, and the convicted criminals would be forced into harsh physical labor in extremely hot conditions. Many of ancient Egypt's greatest structures, including including the Great Pyramids, were built by slaves who were likely serving time for past crimes. And what some people would regard as being worse than a death sentence, some criminals would also be sold into slavery for extended periods of time. Many of the slaves would often pass away from injuries sustained during work or malnourishment, so casualties were very common during the construction of large monuments. Many viewed this work as just an elongated form of capital punishment, so this was widely regarded as one of the worst punishments a person could receive in ancient Egypt. Next up is crocodile feeding. This brutal form of capital punishment was mainly reserved for repeat offenders. It was often used for anyone who had been caught stealing valuables on multiple occasions. This would be the final form of punishment that they would ever receive. First-time offenders would usually just pay a fine and return the stolen goods, but they would also need to swear by an oath that they would never steal again. This meant that anyone who broke the oath would bring a great dishonor to the empire and would literally be tossed to the crocodiles. Now, while most people would listen to the warning and would never steal again, some decided to take their chances and return to their criminal ways. Maybe they thought they were calling the pharaoh's bluff, but this just wasn't a good decision. There was absolutely no chance of defending yourself if you went against the oath, and there was no way of escaping the crocodiles. This was by far one of the most gruesome ways a person could go in ancient Egypt. After that, we have ear and nose amputations. Authorities in ancient Egypt were not afraid to take away your senses if you were a bad citizen. While we've already heard of people having their hands cut off, others would face another form of amputation punishment if they were caught in the act of adultery. While the punishment for this crime came in various forms in ancient Egypt, one of the absolute worst of them all was a person having their nose and ears cut off. It's quite clear by now that ancient Egypt had no time for anyone who committed adultery, but some of these punishments were truly on another level. This type of amputation was meant to take away a person's vital senses, but it also ensured that it would negatively affect their appearance. The authorities wanted to make sure that no one would find the criminal attractive again, so removing body parts was their way of achieving this. Of course, losing your hearing and sense of smell also made this one of the worst punishments ever. And last but not least, we have drowning. Yet another straightforward punishment that was used for some of the worst criminals in the land. This technique was used by many ancient governments as a form of capital punishment, but it was reserved for some of the most hated citizens around. Anyone who had committed a major crime or was a repeat offender could have received this terrible fate. Drowning was also a symbolic way of showing that a particular criminal had absolutely no friends in society. Authorities didn't want to waste any time or resources on them and simply wanted them out of their lives as quickly as possible. The criminal would usually be tied to a stick to ensure they couldn't escape before they were tossed into the water. Not only would the criminal's life come to an abrupt and terrible ending, but they would also have to go out knowing that absolutely nobody liked them. This should have been a fair warning to any criminal that they need to make some very serious changes in their lives.
Number 10. Marriage.
Poor good women have lost a marriage into war, famine, disease, and disaster.
I know some might think initially that this isn't a punishment, but in the cases of the Victorian women, the societal status of being a woman was only seen based off of the ideologies that needed to be pure and clean. Your bodies were seen as temples, and it shouldn't be decorated with jewelry, nor should it be used for physical activities or your own personal pleasures. You couldn't oppose men, and you being wealthy or a spinster was the only exception. Single women were looked down on with shame and pitied, and as your main purpose as a woman was to marry and reproduce. Even young girls at the age of 8 to 12 would stop working as if there was no child labor laws or protection laws for children, and as soon as these women or young girls were able to menstruate, they would be negotiated into marriage and no longer be able to sustain themselves financially or just be a kid. And being a poor married woman wasn't an option, as you had no individual rights under law. Married women were only seen as one with their husband, and the husband would be the manager and entitled to all of your properties, as it was seen more as a business, and you were being micromanaged constantly until death do you part. Number 9. No rights. As I mentioned with marriage, women didn't have any rights, as they were seen primarily as second-class citizens, and if you were a woman of color, my goodness, you were definitely seen less than human. Women who had to be married ended up losing everything they owned, inherited, or earned, and it would belong to their husband. Once a woman married, control of any property she owned as well as any income she received from it passed her husband. Although he could not dispose of it without her consent, her property, her personal property such as money, or earnings or investments, and personal belongings such as jewelry passed absolutely into his control. She could not part with them without his consent, and if you were in a loveless marriage or a harmful one, you couldn't divorce your husband. Divorce wasn't even a concept for women to execute without losing their own amenities, even in the court of law until the 1970s, almost 100 years or so later, after the spark of the women's suffrage movement in the mid-late 1800s. So men had the right to divorce his wife under the grounds of adultery, but women had to prove her husband was unfaithful, combined with other allegations including cruelty, bigamy, incest, and so on. Luckily, in the 1857 Act, divorce did become a bit easier little by little, but again, only under the impression that the woman had legal grounds and proof her husband was unfaithful. unfaithful with evidentiary support to back up her claims. And even then, she could finally earn some of her possessions. As for the husbands, if he wanted to divorce his wife, he didn't have to do anything, he could just say it and it would be fine. Number 8. No education. To me, education is extremely important, as it was something I learned growing up in my family, that education liberates you to understand yourself, those around you, and the world better. And for women in this era, they were received less education than men. They were banned from universities and could only obtain low-income paying jobs, as she was not allowed to follow a profession, as they were all closed to women. And the irony of them having Queen Victoria as the reigning accolade of this era, a woman and women of these times couldn't get an education to liberate herself or her children from defamation if the husband no longer sees her as a useful asset. So for women, especially those who could afford it, was raised in a privileged household with financial backings and exceptional family background, her education was only seen as accomplishments. Like, oh darling, she's a very accomplished woman, is something you might hear in these type of movies that depict the era, which only indicates that she had artistic talents like singing, dancing, and knowing foreign languages, and anything to help earn them a husband and be a benefit in the house. Even doctors at this time believed that if a woman studied too much education, she would stunt her ability to reproduce. Wild as hell. And when university allowed women to attend their lecture halls, their families would actually forbid them from going, worried that it would prevent them from finding a husband. Number 7. The right to work. Work was only available to those who had no choice, as their societal status prevented them from leveling up to the ladder to have a better life independently. Even more so, women who were labeled as part of the working class, these women fueled the industrial revolutions, making up to 60 to 80% of the working force in light industries such as cotton manufacturing. Even more so, those who were labeled as part of the working class, women of this era fueled the industrial revolutions, making up to 60 to 80% of the workforce in light industries such as cotton manufacturing. Women that had jobs outside of the home made them less likely to marry, leaving them with no choice but to stay in undesirable situations that made them undesirable themselves. In one study by the Buffalo State had noticed classing women and children together as helpless creatures needing the protection of strong men. They were indignant at the knowledge that women had to support themselves, that they had suffered degrading wrongs as working women. So for some, they'd have to result themselves into committing adult work, or even for some unfortunate circumstances, be sold into adult work, as they had often had heavy debts from predecessors or even used as bargaining chips for their partners. Poor women were not regarded as the Victorian society, as they could not fight back, as men had captured these women, straight up kidnapping them and kept them at their house. Differences in societal classes led to some women being ignored and unacknowledged in society for economic reasons and for the pleasures of some men. Women of the night had no exits of this profession and were stuck in this life, and they would be beaten, tormented, as this was obviously shamed on, as well as being arrested, which would lead us to number 6. Number 6. Women who were in prison. In some revolutionary standpoints, being in prison might make you look like a hero or a villain, as it depends on what you were doing or what you stood for. For the Victorian era, women who had been the most vocal at this time for a multitude of things like women's rights, the women who were caught in the act of selling their bodies in order to obtain financial means would be arrested and sent to prison. But even women who were not adult workers would be arrested. Women who had premarital pregnancies, truancies, or adultery, or kept bad company would also be arrested. They would be sent to prisons or reformatories, as for women of these times, a small step off of the Victorian pedestal made for a long fall. Women sent to prison in the Victorian England were subjected to regimes whose project was to enforce idealized femininity. This individualized treatment aimed at more regeneration than discipline, and was administered by an entirely female staff aided by middle-class philanthropic lady visitors. Considering women were placed only into two categories, being a wife and a mother, the reality is that they lived in a world that discriminated heavily against them. Due to their superior physical strength, men considered themselves the dominant sex and sought to keep women subdued for as long as they could. Number 5. Prison life. Being accused of being an idle and disorderly woman seems like a very vague and inconvenient statement today, as it holds no worthy of prosecution, but for these women of these times, you would definitely go to jail for that. These roughly defined offenses were common charges against women in the 18th century. At least in some records of the names of these women have survived, there are 2 on the list who are silently identified, only known as an unknown woman, cannot give any account of herself, and the other being accused of being a vagrant and an idiot. Which, of course, being an idiot isn't a crime unless you're doing something idiotic that hurts another person. Then yeah, I guess being an idiot is a crime. It is possible that up to 2/3 of prisoners in the House of Corrections, like the one at the prison called the Wakefield House of Correction, were female. Beating hemp was the usual form of hard labor, as well as if the women refused to comply or being able to commit to tasks, whipping and beatings were also a commonplace, particularly to those who convicted of vagrancy, lewd conduct, and night walking. Number 4. Domestic harm. This is sort of stemming back to the whole marriage thing in number 10, as it basically ties in on how horrible life was being a woman in the Victorian era, or just being a woman in general in any historical time. With these sacrifices and determinations of these women, as they ensured the women like me were able to gain access slowly but surely to equal rights, but sadly when it comes to marriage for some of these women, they're also at risk of being being in harmful relationships that were extremely normalized at the time. Violence against women and the lack of protection was common as there were no laws for the physical violations they had to endure. After all, when you got married, everything you owned belonged to your husband, and so did your body, with or without consent. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and the 1850s. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and 1850s about the domestic harm and other marriage issues that affected women. Like all laws that slowly opened gateways to other clauses, the 1828 Offences Act that targets working class violence helped a cultural shift on the subject, and domestic violence became a topic to the public. Number 3, the angel of the house. Or the angel in the house. When it came to the liberation, it all stemmed with the women's rights groups fought for equality and over time made strides in attaining rights and privileges. However, many Victorian women endured their husbands' control and even cruelty, including sensual violence, verbal abuse, and economic deprivation. And there's no way out of it as it got worse, as a man named Coventry Patmore published a book called Angel in the House. It consisted of poems and the ideal Victorian marriage, and although it came from a place of grief at the loss of his first wife, the book had suddenly become a staple in women's behaviors and marriages, and then became a standard of their status. A woman's proper role was to love, honor, and obey her husband, as her marriage vows stated. A wife's place in the family hierarchy was secondary to her husband, but far from being considered unimportant. A wife's duty to tend to her husband and properly raise her children were considered crucial cornerstones of social stability by the Victorians. Representations of ideal wives were abundant in Victorian culture, providing women of their role models, and the Victorian ideal of the tirelessly patient, sacrificing wife is what depicted the angel in the house. And for these middle-class women, mimicking the angel in the house gave them more opportunities to find a successful match in marriage. Number 2, the House General. The House General, in a term coined in 1861 by Isabella Beeton in her influential manual, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. Because for women they needed a manual on how to be a good wife, a good woman, and a good so on and so forth. Here she explained that the mistress of the house is comparable to the commander of an army or the leader of an enterprise. To run a respectable household and secure the happiness and comfort and well-being of her family, she must perform her duties intellectually and thoroughly. For example, she had to organize, delegate, and instruct her servants, which was not an easy task as many of them were not reliable. Isabella Beeton's upper-class readers may also have a large complement of domestics, a staff requiring supervisions by mistress of the house. Beeton's advised her readers to maintain a housekeeping account book to track spending. She recommends entries and checking the balance monthly, but also keep in mind this is the same lady who told people to put borax in bread to save money. This may not seem like a big punishment for some viewers, but if you were told that you needed a manual to how to live your life so you wouldn't be kicked out of society, that's not something that's a preference today, is it? And number 1, Asylum. Now, if you're a woman who was out of the realms and just didn't want to be part of society like everyone else, maybe just suffered a series of mental health issues or even just looked ugly, you might find yourself in an asylum. They had such ridiculous reasons to lock up a woman, as I mentioned in the prison section on this list. From being a vagrant, disorderly, or whatever the case was, you'd go to prison, or even more so, to the asylum. For some families, if they just didn't know what to do with you, they just toss you into the asylum for not being complicit. In an investigation by a very passionate and amazing writer named Nellie Bly, she had experienced firsthand on the field of the mistreatments, the devastating conditions, and harm patients had to endure. In her report published in 1887 and later published in the book 10 Days in the Madhouse, it caused such a sensation it prompted the asylum to implement reforms and shed the light on the significant impact on American culture. Anyways, being a woman was tough as hell in the Victorian era, but with their determination for the right to vote, the women's suffrage movement that enforced lawmakers to ensure them to obtain sustainability today is the reason why there are so many genuinely incredible women who are able to become who they want to be. And it is important to note, those who do not know how to look back at where they came from will never get to their destination. So be sure to read up and learn a lot. After all, the answer in our future is laid dormant in our past. Number 10. Drowning. Drowning as a form of punishment was not a common practice in ancient Egypt, at least as far as historical records and archaeological evidence indicate. The ancient Egyptians had a legal system with various forms of punishment, but the various methods were typically less severe than drowning. But in records of the Code of Hammurabi, which was one of the oldest and known legal codes in human history, it provided a comprehensive set of laws covering a wide range of aspects of daily life, including civil, criminal, and commercial matters. One of the most famous aspects of the code is the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which laid out specific punishments for various offenses. Mentioning drowning if there was adultery with a neighbor's wife, or if you had intimate relations with your daughter-in-law, more or less these punishments would go both ways, but interestingly enough, the laws depended on the person. Number 9. Disinheritance. In ancient Egypt, inheritance and property rights were complex and evolved over time, with some variations depending on the specific period and social status of individuals. Generally, women did have rights to inherit property, but there was significant differences between men and women in terms of inheritance. During the early dynastic periods, women had relatively more rights and they could inherit and own property. However, as the society became more stratified and centralized with the rise of the pharaonic state, inheritance laws became in favor more for males. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, women's rights to property and inheritance were gradually eroded. Property, especially land, was usually passed from father to son. Women could gain property through marriage contracts, dowries, or gifts, which they could then pass on to their children. But if they lose their inheritance, so do their children. Thankfully, there was legitimate ways of structuring a will, making unequal distributions of disinheriting a person so to minimize challenges which do not involve corporal punishment. These include a gift conditional upon the recipient not challenging the will, a no contest clause diverting assets outside the will by writing a life insurance policy into trust, or passing assets through the will to a secret trust. Number 8. Banishment. In ancient Egypt, as in many ancient societies, the legal system was complex and the punishment for various offenses could vary depending on factors such as the severity of the crime, the societal status of an individual involved, and the time period in question. Banishment was one possible punishment, but it was not the common form of punishment. Banishment in ancient Egypt was being expelled from a community or city was generally used for serious offenses or crimes. It was a severe punishment because it meant the individual was cut off from their community and likely left to fend for themselves in the harsh environment outside settled areas. And for women, it was typically a rare occurrence as the legal system in ancient Egypt was based on the code of law that changed over time, and evidence suggests that women could be subjected to various forms of punishments for their crimes, including banishment. Number 7. Punishment. More commonly, punishments for women in ancient Egypt might have included fines, corporal punishments, or forced labor. For serious crimes, especially those that threatened the social order or involved treason, more severe punishments like execution might be applied, but in some cases for less serious offenses, women might be required to pay fines. These fines could be in the form of money, goods, or livestock. Women, particularly those of lower social status, could be sentenced to perform labor as a form of punishment. This might involve agriculture work, construction, or other forms of manual labor. Depending on the nature of the offense, a woman's property or belongings could be confiscated as a form of punishment. As mentioned earlier, banishment was a possible punishment for serious offenses. Number 6. Beatings. In ancient Egypt, like in many ancient societies, corporal punishment, including beatings, could be a form of punishment for women, particularly for offenses that were considered serious or morally reprehensible according to the prevailing nature and culture and legal norms. It's important to note that the application of punishment varied depending on factors such as societal status and specific time period and the region within ancient Egypt. Corporal punishments such as whipping, beating, or other forms of physical punishment could be administered for various offenses. This might be more common for crimes like theft or adultery. Examples would be like switches, flexible branches, or vines could have been used for beatings. They would be capable of inflicting pain without causing severe injury, as wooden paddles with a flat surface could also be used for beating as well. They would also have been effective in delivering blows to specific areas of the body, and the simplest form of beating would be involved with the hands and fists. This method would also be easily accessible and wouldn't have to require any specialized tools, as well as whips, sticks, and rods. Number 5. Strangulation. Now for the more morbid section on this list, although stoning may seem like a common thing in this era as a form of capital punishment, whereas an individual is pelted with stones until death actually was not common associated with ancient Egyptian legal practices based on available historical and archaeological evidence. The primary method of execution in ancient Egypt was typically strangulation or impalement. Stoning as a form of capital punishment is more commonly associated with other ancient cultures in the region, such as ancient Mesopotamia or parts of the Levant. In these societies, stoning was indeed known as a form of capital punishment for various offenses, including adultery. Strangulation was one of the most common methods of execution in ancient Egypt. It was typically used for serious offenses and could be applied for both men and women. In cases where capital punishment was deemed necessary, strangulation was a method employed to carry out the sentence. Number 4. Lacerations. When it comes to corporal punishments, as I mentioned above, those who do commit adultery might deal with the consistency of beatings or lacerations. Texts speak of thrashing with a wooden stick, give 10 to 20 to 50 to 100 or even 200 times. They also mention branding and mutilation of the nose and ears. Tomb reliefs often show beatings of people, but in most cases these are private coercions of subordinates, not an official penalty. Sometimes the culprits are bound to a pillory. These punishments were all carried out in public public, and therefore also meant a loss of honor and degradation of the culprits. The results of these measures can be seen on many skeletons, as they are also including cutting off limbs, noses, and other parts of the body as a form of punishment, specifically connected to adultery or if you were married, specifically a married woman. It is a crime deserving of death, as it is easier to commit any other sin after that. The husband had a legal right to punish or forgive his wife or leave the court if the husband accuses the wife with no proof. The punishment of a man was much lighter, and the woman of the crime of adultery, as the Egyptians believed, that offense falls primarily in the hands of the woman, while the women would be killed as the men would severe just 1,000 blows. Number 3, burning alive. Referring back to the Code of Hammurabi, the code was enlisted under the morals and the laws in ancient Egypt and Babylon. When it came to intimate relationships with your close family, you'd be subjected to many listed punishments, as in dealing with seduction or physically harming someone intimately. The Hammurabi inflicts the penalty of burning if you were to have a physical intimacy with your mother, but since this was ancient Egypt, unless you were royal who needed to pull an Oedipus complex to maintain your rule and connection to the monarch position, it wasn't something looked down on but normalized. As this is a civilization that needed a monarch rule at all times to guide the nation, but it is good to note that it was a typical Western interpretation that this era was prone to burning alive people, when the irony was that the Europeans burning women, being witches or even more heresy, were more burned. Number 2, head be gone. The ancient Egyptians set harsh punishments for those accused of treason or corruption. The death penalty was usually applied by impalement, thumping, or a 100-fold fine, and this applied to both men and women. The decree also referred to the death penalty for someone who steals an animal belonging to the temple and transfers it to another party, while confiscating the property of the thief in favor of the stolen temple. The ancient Egyptians distinguished between the stolen goods and the attribute of holiness, and considered it a religious crime that requires execution, and those stolen goods that do not affect the sanctities, settling for the penalties of beating and the fine for the theft 100 times of the value of the stolen items. Number 1, buried alive. Of course, all of these leads to death eventually, as the punishments were drastic, dangerous, violent, and vile. I mean, if you somehow survived the beheading, then what a miracle that would be. But death was only reserved for the extreme measures of punishment for women of these times. As I mentioned, there was very minimal, if not just the common punishment of corporal punishment. The scariest, in my opinion, would be buried alive. In some cases, individuals might be sentenced to be buried alive, although this was likely a very rare extreme form of punishment, most likely only reserved for the ones with extreme cases of crime. It's important to keep in mind that our knowledge of specific cases and punishment in ancient Egypt is limited, as much of what we know is derived from inscriptions, legal texts, and other historical records. Additionally, practices may have varied over time and in different regions of ancient Egypt. The legal systems and punishments evolved over the millennia, so there could be variations in practices depending on the specific period within ancient Egypt history. Violence against women is a human rights violation, potentially touching on the rights to life, to equality, to liberty, and security of persons, to equal protection under the law, to be free from all forms of discrimination and violence, to the highest standard attainable of physical and mental health, to just the favorable conditions to work, as well as the rights to not subjected to and cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment. And although the cruelty and damages to women was abhorrent and tragic, it still lingers in our day, as now 60% of women still don't report crimes due to fear of shame and stigma. But we still need to be safe spaces to those who need reassurance so that they can speak up. We still got a lot of work to do, you know?
Such as the first one to make me puke, number 10, denailing. It's one of those torment styles I feel needs no explanation. The name kinda says it all, but to include you in the horror, the definition of denailing is the forcible extraction of fingernails or toenails or both. And man, was it a favorite method of the medieval times. And a fun fact I learned, the term cutting it to the quick actually originates with this horrible punishment. The quick is the nickname for the fingernail skin, aka hypocochium. So when you're cutting it to the quick, you're digging up someone's fingernails. In its simplest form, denailing was done by first constraining the prisoner on whatever tabletop or chair, whatever you got ready to tie a person to. Then metal forceps or pliers, often heated over fire until red hot, grasp each nail at its edge and tear it from its nail or toe bed. Okay, Ma, this right here is why I am okay with the fact you never broke my nail biting habit. Unfortunately for me, the other variant of this would have still worked, because in version 2, they wedge something under the nail first and then hit it inwards to separate the nail from its bed. This was a favored method of the medieval German witch hunters, who would dip the wooden skewers in boiling sulfur before wedging them in, which would burn the incredibly sensitive flesh of the underside of the nail. When enough skewers have been driven home to ply each nail loose from the bed, only then is the nail torn from the root with a pair of pliers. Okay, one and done. Let's hit number 9, which is stocks. And just like the stock market, it's scary and confusing. The people involved are sitting on their ass. Sorry, the joke was there, I had to go for it. So, stocks stock is both physical torment and public humiliation, the best of both types of medieval punishments. Okay, so you know that thing where they bend you over and they put your head and your wrists in it like this, as seen in the beautiful period piece Shrek? The stocks are similar, but for your feet. Difference is that a person is placed in the stocks sitting with their legs extended in front of them and their feet are locked into place. Sometimes their hands or their head might be chained for funsies too, but overall they're left lying on the ground, or if they're lucky they have something under their butt. Stocks could be found in the most public places available, where a town crier would come out shaking that big ass bell and telling the bored masses they could contribute to punishing offenders against the standard of conduct of the time, aka free for all. See this defenseless person literally lying on the ground having an existential crisis because all they did was have a pimple that looked kind of like a witch spot, and now their feet are in a Lego block? Get some repressed, unacknowledged feelings out. Feel free to berate, attack, spit, kick, urinate, defecate, or even violate the man or woman in their immovable state. This was super popular among civil authorities in medieval times and was at its peak use during the Elizabethan England and the Spanish conquistadors, tormenting those in the New World who fought back against Christianization. It was not uncommon for people to be kept in stocks for several days to die of hypothermia or heat stroke. Number 8 is the Catherine wheel, which was named after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who wasn't ever actually killed on one of these, but the fictitious story stuck and so did the name. So, medieval France and Germany loved this bad boy, which was essentially a giant cartwheel put on a lazy Susan. Folks would be stretched out on it and then tied down, then quite literally became a wheel of fortune, because ideally the dude wielding the massive hammer taking swings at you while you slowly spin in a circle gets dizzy and misses. More often than not though, folks ain't that lucky. This wheel would be spun nice and slow over the hours, and the hammer wielder would break different limbs as they circled past him. Once all the limbs were reduced to spiky bone fragment skin slabs, sorry, but the person was left on the wheel to die. It could take hours, even days, before shock and dehydration did its course. If your offense was less severe, or you could bribe someone, or you were at least well liked, the first blow would be to the neck in hopes of smoking you quickly, known as coup de grace, aka blows of mercy. Otherwise, they went from the feet up, baby, and the number of sequences of blows are specified in the court sentence. How, as a lady, did you earn the Catherine's wheel? Cheating, witchcraft, treason. Next up for number 7 is the Picat, the perfect device for your DIY executioner. All you need is a stake, a hole in the ground to stick it out of, some rope, and a little bit of friendship. It was usually used as a military punishment, however the Picat did make its rounds, even ending up in a famous illustration of a woman being subjected to it during the French Revolution. Alright, so what you need to pick up from your Hobby Lobby or your Michael's Craft Store is a stake. You're gonna stick one end of it in the ground and then the exposed end facing upwards. Make sure to grab a saw and sandpaper, because you're gonna need that exposed end to be sharpened to a rounded point, not a pointy point. Now grab some rope and your malefactor, who is typically a soldier who had disobeyed order, or a woman accused of witchcraft or sleeping around. You're gonna use that rope to suspend them from the tree by this region of the thumb, while the sole of their opposite bare foot was balanced on top of the stake. The point of the stake was sharp enough to jab into the arch uncomfortably, but not enough to pierce your foot. Want to get the pressure off? You have to regulate all your body weight into the thumb that's suspending you. And yes, you may be thinking, wouldn't that tear your thumb from its socket? Absolutely, which is why you'd shift your weight back onto the painful foot. Pretty ingenious methodology, if you ask me. Nobody died, but some people did lose thumbs. Better than your life though. This is a classic mention on our channel. Number 6 is the shame masks. If they tried to use those on us today, I personally don't think it'd work. The way that pride and ego function in modern days is so different from olden times, but back then, I guess it must have been an efficient humiliation tactic for them to have so many of these horrible masks. That, or people really vibe with the Halloween vibe. These masks, as mentioned, are meant to humiliate, and I guess there's nothing more humiliating than being compared to a pig or a rooster. 2 of their most common designs. Some would have a pig snout, bird beak, devil horns, donkey ears. Bells are sometimes attached to attract the attention to the wearer, or even whistles attached to the mouthpiece, so anytime they breathe, the stupid thing would make a sound like the Tin Man from Wizard of Oz was approaching. Although less vicious than many other torments, they could still be painful and distressing, especially if your sentence is a long one. The mask could make it difficult to eat, drink, sleep, and could attract violence from hostile people or lecherous men. They were used as punishments for various misdemeanors, but usually it was to shut a woman up. Literally. You scolded your husband, that's a serious sin that contravened the Bible's clear instructions for wives to remain subservient, little Well, I was gonna say Barbie dolls, but maybe after the movie, it's Ken's. Number 5 is also used to shut wives and women up. It's the Shrew Fiddle and Fife. But I could be wrong. It could be pronounced Fife like the country or Fief like thief. Cannot tell for the life of me. Anyways, you've heard the boring shrew scold 100 times. I'm here to bring you a new exciting product if you want to publicly shame some women, but also simultaneously make it look like they're starting medieval times' most vibing jazz band. The Shrew Fiddle or shame fiddle was a wooden contraption shaped roughly like a fiddle or a fife or fief or whatever it is, which is a type of flute that acted like a portable stocks for your fingers and your neck. The shame flute was specifically designed to punish those who made bad music. However, these shrew's implements are titled after the ladies that were tossed in them constantly, people who spoke up to their husbands or argued with one another. The next 4 titles on this list, I'm not kidding, are all rippers of some kind. We're gonna start with number 4, the chest ripper. If I instinctually put my hands on my chest while we're talking, you will understand why in a second. This was a device made specifically and only for women to destroy a very specific aspect of femininity and thus remove what the medieval people perceived to be her desirability. And man, did these dudes have a weird ass fixation on doing stuff to breasts. Burned, brand, carved, or simply amputated. This is called sensual torture, but swap the N and the S for the letter X. It extends back to the time of ancient Rome and likely long before then too, but worst of all was a device coined in medieval England known as the breast ripper. A metal claw that pierced the flesh of the breast of the victim who was tied down and then pulled away forcibly, shredding it to pieces. It was used as both a method of punishment to mark breasts of unmarried mothers and women convinced of heresy, adultery, and hosts of other crimes, but also for interrogation, because nothing is gonna make someone confess to being a witch faster than a sociopath with a giant pair of tongs. Number 3 is a rear ripper. It's unlikely, but if there was anything worse than the breast ripper, it's probably the pair of anguish. Recognizable now from video games and movies and leather bedrooms with red latex accents, this pear-shaped device was one of the many horrific devices that made it to the modern world, but was reborn with better purposes. A few medical devices have taken a page out of its book, such as the dreaded thing they use at gynecology appointments, and some birthing and colonoscopy gear. So, the pear is made up of 4 leaves. These are joined at the hinge at the top and a key or a crank on one end. As you can see on screen, it's named accordingly. The pear was inserted into one of the 3 viable orifices, 2 if it's a dude, depending on the nature of the crime committed. The oral device was reserved for heretics, while the back door and the middle door pairs were used on, you could never guess, witches, witchcraft. Ooh, man, medieval times must have looked like the set of Halloween Town, the way that witchcraft is constantly referenced. Anyways, turning the key opened the leaves, and every little click of the key causes massive internal damage that was rarely fatal, but very thorough way to get a confession out of someone, or just about anything. I'm pretty sure the average person would admit to something as ludicrous as riding a magic donkey out of the king's palace if it meant that would stop. Number 2 is another rear ripper. Yeah, they liked those. Come to think of it, for such a essentially repressed society, they seem to get quite raunchy with their punishments. It's almost like that's the reason you shouldn't repress feelings like that. The Judas Cradle, also known as the gilded cradle, was a regular stool with a wooden or metal pyramid on the top. The victim would be stripped, tied with ropes on all 4 limbs, and then like some elaborate Marvel movie setup behind the scenes, they get lifted into the air and suspended just over top of the pyramid. Then their bits are adjusted to sit right on top of the pyramid. From here, the captive holder could torment them further, try to get confessions, whatever, before letting loose more and more of the person's own body weight, which would slowly impale them downwards on the pyramid, which in turn would start making room for itself. This punishment method was frequently used in the Inquisition, but I invite you to guess when else. Could it be A, witchcraft, B, witchcraft, or C, witchcraft? If you guessed any of those 3, you're right, because pretty much every medieval punishment for a woman was because she talked too much or made a soup that tasted too good, so the devil must have done it. Alright, the last on our little ripping montage, number 1 is the rail rip, aka a wooden horse, also known as riding the rail. It's an effed device of which there are 2 variations. The first is like a balance beam from gymnastics but triangular, mounted on a sawhorse-like support. The victim is made to straddle the triangular horse and place their full body weight down on the hoo-ha area, which rested on the blunt point of the angle. Weights and additional restraints were added to keep the victim from falling off, but also to drag them down. Left for days, it can begin destroying your pelvis as well as dislocate all of the joints in your legs. A less immediately painful variation is a single plank of wood supported, again with the wooden legs or sometimes suspended from the ceiling, horizontal from the floor on its side with a thin edge and sharpened extremely. The victim is made to straddle the plank, which is adjusted to their height so that they have to stand on their tiptoes or let their hoo-ha, meet a very serrated fate. This wasn't a witchcraft one ironically, but rather for adulterers, working girls, or women who breathed a little too hard and their husbands wanted them gone.